Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Lauren, and today I'm going to be discussing all of the books that I read in January. So January was a pretty decent reading month for me. I'm actually pretty proud of the amount of reading I got done in January, and the reason is because my husband and I did a fair amount of traveling this past month. We had COVID over Christmas, so we couldn't travel. The first couple weekends of January, that's when we were making up for the time we had missed, so traveling to and from our parents' houses. And I was actually still able to get a good amount of reading done. I read a grand total of 2,187 pages. I started 7 books. 6 of those I completed, and 1 of those was unfortunately a DNF. As far as ratings went for the books that I did complete, I had 2 3 stars, 2 3.5 stars, 1 4 star, and 1 4.5 star. As usual, I will start with the book that I liked the least, or actually I'll start with the book that I DNF'd and then work my way up to the book that I liked the very most. That way we can end on a high note. So let's just jump right in and talk about everything I read in January. So the book that I ended up DNFing, unfortunately, was Escape Reality by Kayla Frost. This is an independently published book. It is a sci-fi novel, and honestly, enough time has passed that I am not even really remembering what the plot synopsis is. Picking it up, I really wanted to read it because it had the memory loss trope in it, and that is one of my favorite tropes. So if anytime I read the synopsis, I'm like, yeah, that's going on my TBR. And the book was honestly off to a good start. It had a really intriguing beginning. It introduced a couple of characters that were interesting to me. Everything was going along really well, and then, I don't know, this was probably just me, but it felt like all of a sudden a bunch of random characters were just getting introduced sort of rapid fire style without a whole lot of development. I don't know, I think maybe I just didn't have the attention span. I didn't have the interest in it for sure. I DNF'd this book at about 25%. I don't want to scare anyone off from reading this book. I truly do think it was kind of a me thing, and also this being an indie book, like, I want to support indie writers. If you're interested in sci-fi and you like the synopsis of this, definitely give it a shot. I don't think that the author necessarily did anything wrong. This was just not the month for me. I may give it a try some other time since I did purchase it. I own it now, but for me in January, this was a DNF. So next up at the bottom of my list, and believe me, it absolutely pains me to have to say this, but it is Upgrade by Blake Crouch. This hurts me. This really hurts me. I rejoined Book of the Month just so I could get a hold of this book whenever it was released, but unfortunately it fell a little bit flat for me. If you are unfamiliar with this plot, it's basically about a man who, I think he's maybe like a police officer or something. Against his will, against his knowledge, he gets injected with some sort of chemical agent that causes him to begin to evolve into a smarter, faster, stronger person. He's trying to figure out what has happened to him, and there's this more nefarious plot at hand about this sort of world takeover of people being forced to evolve into these like superhumans, I guess. It's very fast-paced, very action-driven. The character development is pretty typical of Blake Crouch. I love him. I love his books, but these are not character-driven books at all. I am absolutely a plot-driven reader. I would take that over, really deep character development any day. That being said, the lack of character development in this book was even obvious to me. Like, it really hindered my enjoyment of this book. Because of it, I never got invested in any of the characters, like, at all. The main character never felt real to me. I never felt anything, no sympathy, no hatred, no good, no bad feelings at all. I felt nothing for him. And so I kind of because of that, I didn't really care what happened to him. I ended up giving this book 3 stars because it was just so unmemorable. I wish I had loved this, and I will definitely pick up the next Blake Crouch book. I'm not giving up on him or anything, but this was just a 3-star read for me, which generally means I'm gonna forget it. Like, this time next year, I will have no recollection of what this was even about. So yeah, 3 stars for Upgrade. Next up the list, we have The Future of Another Timeline by Annalee Newitz. This is a sci-fi novel of kind of like the time travel variety, and this is the second book that I've read by this author. The first one was Autonomous. I also gave this book 3 stars. The plot of this book, if you're unfamiliar with it, it kind of follows 2 sort of parallel timelines. The first is the modern day timeline, 2022 timeline, I believe, and the character's name is Beth, and she is able to travel through time to change events in the past in order to sort of enact change. And then the other timeline is set in the past. It's in 1992. It follows Beth. We're not really sure why we're following her. It doesn't begin to, make sense until you get pretty close to the end. One of those timelines was far more interesting to me, like by a long shot. It was Beth's, the one set in the 90s. The modern day plot line that followed Tess was riddled with scientific jargon that I really had a hard time like maintaining any kind of interest in. One thing that I really enjoyed about this book, and what I found to be true about this and Autonomous, I think this is just kind of Annalee Newitz, it's their sort of signature thing when they write, are stories that are very feministic, very girl power, which I really enjoy in novels. But if you don't, you will not like this book at all, I guarantee it. Overall, I did enjoy this book, but also a book that I am not going to remember long term. I had a good time reading it, and if you're into time travel stories, then I would definitely recommend it to you. However, for me personally, pretty forgettable, just middle of the road 3-star novel for me. So take that as you will. Next up the list, we have Just Like Home by Sarah Gailey. This is a literary horror urban fantasy maybe. It was very thematically rich, so definitely like felt kind of literary to me. This is a very slow and quiet story about a woman who gets called home to her childhood home. Her mother is dying, and so she's been called home to basically help prepare for her mother's death and pack up the home. She has a very unhappy past. Her memories of this home are very unhappy, and so she's basically just returning home out of obligation. Going into this book, I knew that it was a very slow-paced, very quiet story. A lot of people have complained about that. Knowing that going into it prepared me, so the slow pace did not bother me at all. In fact, I found the writing to be really beautiful. I really like the way Sarah Gailey writes. I actually was really enjoying this book up until like the very ending. It was simultaneously like extremely metaphorical and symbolic, but also completely on the nose. This book is definitely trying to speak to a very specific audience. I think that if someone from the correct audience reads this book, this could definitely be very impactful and very meaningful. However, if you are not this audience, there's a good chance it's going to come across as being kind of absurd, kind of ridiculous. I am not the audience that this book is speaking to at all. However, I do understand what the author was trying to do. So I didn't dock it too hard. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. I don't know. It was, like I said, a little too on the nose at the end, a little too out there, and I couldn't really relate to it. So there just wasn't really any way I could give it more than 3.5 stars personally. But I'm definitely going to hang on to this book. I liked it. It was well told, a beautiful book, and yeah, so a pretty all right experience with Just Like Home. Next up on the list, we have We Should Have Left Well Enough Alone by Ronald Malfi. This is a short story collection. It is horror short stories. It's always weird trying to rate a short story collection though. This book had both like just amazing 5-star stories in it, and it had some that were just really not for me, like maybe 2-star stories. You kind of have to take the average of everything, which for me came out to be 3.5 stars. The title is the main theme of this book. Because you messed with something when you should have left it alone, this horrible thing has come to pass. Like, so you should have left well enough alone, which I thought was like a really intriguing premise, a very interesting theme to be explored. Overall, I did enjoy it, although it started out really strong and just kind of slowly went downhill. The final story, to me, didn't even feel like it went with the collection at all. I didn't get it. The stories that I liked best in this included, if you want to read them for yourself, included Under the Tutelage of Mr. Trueheart, The House on Cottage Lane, The Housewarming, Closing In, and Pain Station. All of those stories were excellent. I love them. There were a handful of more stories that I thought, pretty good, pretty middle of the road. And then the ones at the end that just not for me. I don't even know why they were included. But yeah, I really like this book. It makes me want to pick up more short story collections. If you are a short story person, if you're a horror story person, I would definitely recommend you give this one a shot. It was absolutely worth the read. Next up the list, we have The Death of Jane Lawrence by Caitlin Starling. I read this for the January Buzzword Challenge. This cover is awesome. I think this is one of the coolest book covers I own. This is a gothic horror novel. It feels very typical, the vibes of it, very atmospheric, the way gothic horror, or just gothic novels in general are, which I really enjoy. This is set in kind of a Victorian type of period, though I think that it's it's like a fictional world that it's set in, but it feels very Victorian. It's this woman named Jane Shorrington, whose parents were killed when she was a small child, and this family, the Cunninghams, took her on as their ward, and they have raised her. She's come of age, but she is ready to sort of venture out into the world herself, but because it is the time period that it is, it's improper for a lady to just be out there in the world living alone, doing her own thing, so she decides that she needs to get married in order to be kind of more legitimate and this to kind of be more allowed for her. She finds a man Augustine Lawrence, who is a doctor, and talks him into marrying her. The one stipulation that he gives her, though, is that she can never go to his family home, this mansion that has been abandoned. He goes and stays there every night, and she cannot go with him. She agrees to this, but through kind of a random turn of events, she ends up having to go to this house in the middle of the night. She shows up on the doorstep, and her new husband, Augustine, is acting very, very, very strange. And so that's kind of the catalyst for the whole plot. That's really where it kicks off, her trying to figure out what is wrong with him, what's wrong with this house, what the heck is going on. I very much enjoyed this book. I really love the creepiness of it, the spookiness of it, the intrigue of it. This was a really fun read. I really liked Jane as a character. I thought she was really a relatable and interesting character. I liked all the characters in this book, actually. I feel like the character development in this book was very good. I also really, really liked that this book, it leaned into the supernatural. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. The reason that I didn't give it a higher rating, as you can tell I'm gushing about it, is that I felt like the ending honestly went off the rails just a little bit. The explanation and wrap-up was strange to me, didn't quite fit the book. But otherwise, I did really enjoy it. This gave me kind of almost like Vita Nostra vibes, although it was a little bit easier to a little bit more accessible, easier to follow and understand. If it weren't for that sort of strange ending, this may have been a 5-star book for me, but nonetheless, very enjoyable. And if you are into gothic stories and horror and just kind of out there stuff, this may be the book for you. And last but not least, the book that I enjoyed the most of everything that I read in January was Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo. I ended up squeezing this in. I could not wait to read it. This was just released in January, and yeah, I was not going to wait on this one. As soon as I got it, I worked it in. I was like, there was a plan. I'm going to read this book. First of all, let's take a minute to appreciate the book cover. Also the end pages. Oh my gosh, if you haven't seen them, just look at that. Continues into the back there. Just so cool. Obviously it's the second book in the series, so I can't go into great detail about the synopsis of this book. The overall idea of it, this is sort of dark academia, and it's about a character. The series follows a character named Alex Stern, who, though she has this very troubled past, has been accepted into Yale, and she was accepted into Yale to sort of join this society that monitors these other societies, these secret societies that are very dark can have very strange, dark rituals. If there's certain things that might bother you, like look up some trigger warnings for these books. But I absolutely love them. I loved Ninth House. I read it when it came out and just fell in love with it, and was super excited to get to the second one, although it's been a couple of years, but was very excited to get to it. And fortunately, this book really, really delivered. It picked up in a good spot, like not too much time had passed since the first book, so I liked where it picked up and how it picked up. It did a good job of sort of rehashing some of the things that had happened in the first book, so you're not completely lost if it's been a while since you've read Ninth House. Similar to Ninth House, this was also told in kind of a dual timeline type of storytelling, which I really, really loved about Ninth House, so I'm glad that it was the same with this. We finally got more on the character that we love the most. If you've read Ninth House, you know this book was written for lovers of that character. Like, this was very fulfilling in that way. And it was also just the creepiness of this book. Like, it was so creepy. This book gave me bizarre dreams. I really loved it. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. I don't think it was a perfect book, but it was pretty dang close. If you are a Ninth House lover and you're kind of on the fence about whether you should pick up the second book, I would say yes, like definitely pick this one up. So I think that is going to be it for me today. These are all of the books that I read in January, these as well as Escape Reality and We Should Have Left Well Enough Alone. I'd be very curious to know if you have read any of these and what you thought about them, so I hope that you will talk to me about it in the comments down below. Also, if you read anything interesting, I would love to talk to you about that as well. I am always looking for my next great book recommendation, so please leave those recommendations down in the comments as well. If you enjoyed this video, I hope that you will like it and possibly subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.